Hello everyone, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Hokage Naruto, Sasuke, Sakura and Hinata traveled back in time with future memories? Part 3. Time passed without much of note happening, despite everything. Team 7's laissez-faire attitude towards their presence in the past had raised some eyebrows amongst those who didn't know the truth of the situation, which was everyone but them and Hinata, but not much of importance had really changed. Mostly it was little things, like Naruto playing more frequently with Konohamaru and friends, and Sakura introducing Sasuke to her parents. Despite them both being physically 12, said introduction was still infinitely less awkward than the last time Sakura had brought her teammate turned enemy turned teammate turned boyfriend turned husband turned teammate turned boyfriend home for the first time. Less complicated, too. And of course, Naruto took no small delight in molding the once more malleable minds of Udon and Moegi. Konohamaru may have been his faithful protege even as an adult, but Ebisu had regretfully gotten to the boys' teammates and made them dreadfully ordinary. The grown-up Udon and Moegi had been two of the most boring people Naruto knew. The less said about the Hyuga, the better. Last one to Ichiraku's is a loser. The former Lord 7th Hokage jeered, cackling as he shot down the street. No fair, boss, wait for us. Ah, Naruto Nichin, hold up. You cheater. Don't go so fast. The Konohamaru Corps chased after their boss idol, Naruto Uzumaki, following him through the streets of Konoha. Huffing and puffing as they tried to keep up with the faster, seemingly inexhaustible blonde, Konohamaru and friends made quite a sight with their ruddy faces screwed up in concentration. Naruto beamed as he led the young academy students up and down the streets, laughing and whooping as he darted nimbly around pedestrians. He kept a steady pace 3 strides ahead of the trio at all times, leading the kids on a merry chase through the village. Don't be sore losers, now. Naruto cheerfully called over his shoulder. Ha ha ha. Just run, run, run as fast as you can. Maybe you'll even catch up, if you're lucky. He peered over his shoulder just in time to see a red-faced Konohamaru reply to this statement with a very rude hand gesture. Naruto laughed. Is that all you've got? Hurry up, hurry up. I haven't even gotten warmed up. He chortled, striking a very theatrical pose while continuing to run, which produced a fairly comical effect. Moegi giggled in spite of herself, and Udon joined in with a half-delirious guffaw. Konohamaru defiantly shook his fist at Naruto. The blonde laughed even more gaily than before, and spun fluidly around a black-clad young man, slipping between him and his pretty blonde companion. Without missing a beat, he was behind the pair and continuing on down the street. At least, he was until he heard a boyish, oof, and a distantly familiar annoyed grunt. Hey, twerp, watch where you're going. That hurt, you know. Oh, Kankuro. Still just as terrible with kids as ever. And still somehow just as good as getting the drop on Naruto, too. Let go of me, you big jerk. Naruto turned around, mildly bemused. Was it really starting already? He glanced curiously between Temari and Kankuro, looking at their backs. This statement did not include Temari's as to any exceptional degree. Naruto could, as Jiraiya's former apprentice, appreciate beautiful young women, but 15 years old was towing the line of too young for his tastes. He made a conscious exception for Hinata, because she was his wife, and he loved her no matter what she looked like. Konohamaru. Moegi squealed, dismayed, breaking Naruto out of his musings. Oh dear, oh dear. Udon whimpered, trembling worriedly at the sight of this intimidating foreigner lifting their friend and ringleader by the collar. Kankuro sneered, and tightened his grip. Konohamaru. Huh, he drawled. Is that your name, twerp? Hey, talk about uninspired. You Konoha pansies. Temari scowled, impatiently side-eyeing her middle brother. Don't waste your time on this brat, Kankuro, she said coolly, evenly. It wouldn't be worth the trouble. Kankuro rolled his eyes. Who cares? I'm just gonna teach the punk to watch where he's going, he said dismissively. You could say I'm doing him a favor, really. It's a very valuable life lesson. Konohamaru swung his legs mutinously. Had his captor been a little less astute, the lad might have scored a hit on the older boy's shin. Kankuro was nothing if not prudent, however, and he deftly evaded the lad's flailing. Let me go. Konohamaru snarled, thrashing angrily but ineffectively. His increased resistance seemed to rile up Moegi and Udon, who clenched their fists and advanced on the much larger Kankuro. Tamari sighed and inched away from her brother, looking like she had no patience for this stupid macho posturing. Kankuro snorted, and curled his free hand into a fist. You should be more respectful to your elders, he sneered, bringing his knuckles up in a blur. Naruto caught Kankuro's first before it even came close to touching Konohamaru, appearing beside Kankuro faster than you could say, holy shit, where'd he come from? The Cage's middle child blinked. His head swiveled to the side, and he stared confusedly at this spiky-haired blonde interloper. Konohamaru slowed his wriggling, and a smirk came onto his face. Ha, you're in for it now, you big jerk. He crowed. Naruto Nichin is gonna kick your ass. Tamari choked back a laugh at the gobsmacked expression on her brother's face. Naruto smiled innocently. I'm sure I have no idea what you mean by that, Konohamaru, he said loftily. After all, it's not like a foreign shinobi visiting Konoha for the Chunin exams would ever be stupid enough to try and do anything to the Sandame's grandson. His innocent smile widened, and Kankuro blinked twice more. The young puppet master went visibly white under his kabuki face paint. He squeaked. The Sandames. He trailed off, staring at Konohamaru in slowly dawning horror. Tamari now looked neither bored nor amused. If anything, she seemed the slightest touch frightened underneath the angry look she shot at her brother. Kankuro, she growled warningly. I told you. Now Kankuro went puce, and he dropped Konohamaru like a hot potato. Ahaha, now, I know what this might look like, he said, his voice cracking, but it's perfectly innocent, honest. Naruto smiled. I'm sure it is, he said sweetly. Just like I'm sure your teammates won't kill you in your sleep for almost getting them kicked out of the village before the exams could even start. Kankuro paled once more, and Tamari fingered the fan strapped to her back with a vicious grin on her face. Naruto then looked up into the branches of a nearby tree. He grinned brightly. Hey, Gaara, he said to the gourd-bearing redhead. Wanna join me at Ichiraku's for some ramen later? You can bring your team along too, if you want. He waved, beaming at his fellow Jinchuriki. Konohamaru, Moegi, and Udon and awed at Naruto's ability to detect the third foreigner hidden from sight. Tamari and Kankuro stared in horrified disbelief at the apparently suicidal blonde. Gaara blinked owlishly, surprised. I nominate Team 7. The Hokage's office fell into a heavy silence following these words. Kakashi Hatake stood at attention in a manner that nonetheless bespoke a deceptive laziness, a kind of disinterested insolence that very few people could pull off, to say nothing of actually getting away with it. All around him, his fellow Chunin expressed their surprise at their colleague's choice to nominate a rookie squad for Chunin examination. The Sandame had only just finished officially announcing the Chunin exams, and already Kakashi was suggesting that his team should take it. For those who hadn't heard about Team 7's uncannily exceptional performance on missions, it beggared belief that the copy ninja could seriously have such a skewed perspective as to nominate his squad for the exams without even the tiniest sign of hesitation. Then, a moment later, Kurenai Uehi stepped forward and nominated Team 8, looking perfectly confident in her students' abilities. And not to be outdone, Asuma Sarutobi stepped forward immediately after her and put forth his Team 10 for consideration as well. It was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop, and Genma looked very sheepish as he picked his Senbon back up off the floor, although his jaw was still visibly slack. Not an eye in the house wasn't staring at Kakashi, Kurenai, and Asuma, whether simply gobsmacked and blatantly disbelieving, or else trying in vain to puzzle out their motives. Hiruzen puffed on his pipe, curiously eyeing the three young Junin leaders. His glance was hooded, his face an unreadable stony mask, and if his eyes lingered a second longer on his son than on the others, then nobody was saying anything. Do you, now, he said, the gravely rasp of his voice cutting through the silence. He folded his hands, humming thoughtfully. I must say, this is highly unusual. Not one, or even two, but three rookie squads. He narrowed his eyes. Are you all quite sure of this? These exams are nothing to sneeze at, as you should well know. Kakashi scoffed. With all due respect, Hokage-sama, I'd be nominating them for Junin consideration if you hadn't already told me that they need to pass the Chunin exams first, he said. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura are ready for promotion. More than ready. Asuma rolled his eyes at this. I never would have pegged you for the sentimental sort, Kakashi, he drawled, shaking his head. But as for my team, I honestly think it would be a good learning experience for him. Ought to be a good kick in the pants for those slackers, he said wryly, a hint of fondness in his tone. And I reckon at least one of them might actually make the cut, to be perfectly honest. Kurenai afforded a smirk at this remark, her eyes gleaming amusedly. Team 8 has really come into its own as well, she said, all but swelling up with pride. Hinata in particular has demonstrated exceptional maturity and leader's qualities. She's set an excellent example for her teammates, and all three have helped each other grow a good deal. Well, mostly it had been Hinata helping Shino and Kiba grow, but Kurenai didn't feel any particular need to give away too much of her prize pupil's talent. It wouldn't do to scare off the competition, after all. Hiruzen took a drag of his pipe, and he cast his gaze over the three Junin sensei. He saw a mixture of pride, confidence, and stubborn determination in each of them. It almost reminded him of his own sensei's eyes, when the man had first confronted the other Kage with the idea of the Chunin exams, all but outright challenging them to send their best and brightest ninja to try and discredit him and his pupils. Resisting the urge to smile at the swell of nostalgia, the Sandaime slowly nodded. He exhaled, smoke billowing from his lips, and closed his eyes. Well, then, he said. If you three are that confident in your team's chances. Iruka sputtered, unable to hold back his disbelief any longer. This is preposterous, he protested, pointing at the three Junin. You can't honestly be saying you think they're seriously ready to take on the Chunin exams. Of course they are, Kakashi said dismissively. Kurenai and Asuma nodded in general agreement. Iruka turned a very interesting shade of red. You're pushing them too far, he exclaimed. Times are different now than they were when you three were young. Those kids may be your genin, but they're still my students. Hiruzen resisted the urge to sigh as the argument unfolded, Iruka Yumino's words coming narrowly close to insubordination. If it weren't for Guy stepping forward in agreement with Iruka's stance, things might have gotten ugly, and Kakashi did not pull his punches, whether fighting or debating. Under other circumstances, Hiruzen may have been inclined to agree with Iruka, but these 9 rookies were all exceptional prospects. Even the least remarkable among their number showed a fair deal of talent and cunning. Iruka was a good man, to be sure, but that wasn't always the most desirable trait in shinobi. It didn't help that this was his first graduating class, either. Iruka was naturally very attached to these kids, and would of course be inclined to have them, well, some might call the man's approach coddling, but Hiruzen had a soft spot for children himself. Kakashi, however, did not appear to agree. They're not your students anymore, Iruka, the copy ninja finished coolly, with a steely edge to his words. They are soldiers under my command. With that verbal slap in the face, Kakashi turned and walked away. Iruka stared as the man went, visibly cringing from those words. Asuma winced, and he muttered, ouch. Low blow, under his breath. Kurenai gave Iruka a sympathetic smile. Well, he was a bit harsh in how he said it, she said, but the gist of it isn't necessarily inaccurate. Besides, I know my team has improved by leaps and bounds since graduating. You shouldn't underestimate those former students of yours, or they might just end up surpassing. Iruka chuckled weakly, and returned the smile with a slow nod. Why yeah, thanks, he said. He's right, of course. Haha, I guess I'm just a little upset to see them growing up so fast. Kurenai gave him a comforting pat on the shoulder, before turning back to sidle up next to Asuma as other Junin-sensei proceeded to nominate their own teams for the exams. Shino was a quiet sort of fellow. Even when spoken to, he did not talk unless he felt like he had something of genuine importance to say, and he was never needlessly loud. He did not yell or shout or holler. He was subtler than that. When Shino wanted to make himself heard, he simply spoke his mind. If the people he was talking to had any sense, then they would listen to what he had to say. If they didn't, then they clearly weren't worth the trouble. That's what his father had taught him, anyways. Subtlety and silence were hallmarks of the shinobi. No ninja worth his salt would go off screaming at the top of his lungs. Speak softly yet firmly, and never about trivial matters. People who could be swayed by loud voices and meaningless chatter were not worth a true shinobi's time. That's what he had learned from his father. Kiba was an idiot, impulsive and obnoxious, and far too quick to anger over little and meaningless things. The Hound user practically defaulted to violence as the only worthwhile method of problem solving, and he pretty used his head only as far as physically bashing it against the nearest obstacle. He was loud and fickle and impulsive, the very antithesis of everything Shino had been taught to value in a ninja. However, Kiba was also fiercely loyal, as quick to make friends as enemies. He had not been put off by the Aburame Haiden like most would have been. Rather, he thought it was wicked, which he would say with a thumbs up and a toothy grin. Shino had never before encountered someone who could earnestly call his Kikaichu colony cool. It was a rather nice feeling, in all honesty. Kiba was probably the first real friend Shino had ever had outside his own clan. Despite their differences, he and Kiba were fast and true, and as thick as thieves. They butted heads plenty, in their own little ways, but at the end of the day both the Aburame and the Inuzuka highly valued camaraderie. Even if their ideas of it were as different as night and day, loyalty was still something that both prized above all else. Under other circumstances, Shino supposed that he and Kiba might have been at odds more often than not. Had Hinata not stepped so brilliantly into the position, the two males might have spent a lot of their time both subtly and overtly vying for the spot of team leader. But as it was, Hinata had assumed the role, and she did a magnificent job of it, too. She seemed like a real natural, and neither Kiba or Shino had any problems with deferring to her. It was funny, in a way, that a girl who had seemed so quiet and reserved in the academy would wind up the distinct superior of someone as competitive and stubborn as Kiba, but Hinata really didn't need to be boastful or aggressive. She led with a soft touch, letting them think as often as not that they were acting of their own initiative when they did as she asked. She indulged them when it was convenient, and kept them in line with carefully chosen compliments and critiques. She pulled their strings like a puppet master working her marionettes, and most scarily of all she did it so warmly and kindly that neither of them could find any fault with it. Even the willful, bull-headed Kiba saw nothing wrong with doing what Hinata asked of him. Shino supposed that the Inuzuka probably had a tiny bit of a crush on her. Not that he could criticize this. He himself felt rather quietly giddy whenever he could sneak a covert glance at Kurenai-sensei, and perhaps intentionally messed up his kata once or twice just so she would correct him. This was only natural, of course. She was a very lovely, very mature woman appointed with teaching and guiding them, and Shino was at that early, pleasantly confusing stage of puberty where he was just starting to really enjoy being around the opposite. However, he also knew that Kurenai and Hinata were each interested in someone else, and that it was very unlikely either of them would ever give him or Kiba the time of day. And Shino was okay with that. Kiba may have been in denial, though. Yeah, I think we're definitely gonna breeze right through this, the tattooed lad quietly boasted as they strolled up to the third floor of the academy. Those other losers don't stand a chance against me and Akamaru. He grinned at Hinata, who smiled indulgently and nodded. If you say so, Kiba-kun, she said politely. She spoke his name fondly, like that of a good friend or a close sibling. Kiba may have misinterpreted this. You won't even need to get your hands dirty, Hinata, he said, grinning wryly. I bet there's not a person here who could take me on in a fight. This declaration earned Kiba a dirty look from a few of the other genin teams climbing the stairs, but he didn't seem to notice. He was strutting self-assuredly to the testing area, confident that Team 8 would pass these exams with flying colors. Hinata giggled at the sight of Kiba with his chest puffed out. He beamed, apparently taking this as a mark of approval. Shino quietly followed his teammates to the testing area, corrugating his brow in thought. Kiba's confidence was not particularly contagious in this instance. Frowning beneath his coat collar, the young Aburame pushed his sunglasses up on the bridge of his nose. He shot a warning look at his male teammate. You shouldn't get too why, he cautioned. These exams will be attracting genin from all across the continent, and many of them will be far more experienced than ourselves. Age and cunning can easily triumph over youth and skill. Kiba scoffed. Don't be such a worrywart, Shino. They aren't the only ones with tricks up their sleeves. He grinned toothily. Hinata smiled, looking between her two teammates. Indeed they are not, she agreed. You two are very skilled for your age. Shino and Kiba looked at her. Ha, the latter guffawed. If we're skilled, then you're a damn genius. Shino nodded. You're easily the strongest member of this team, he said. We know this because we've seen you in action. Kiba blushed. Yeah, he said, scratching his cheek. You've done some damn good work. You know, with your kata and training and all. You two have improved markedly more than I have, Hinata said with a dismissive wave of her hand. My own skills are. She shrugged, trailing off. A result of actually being 10 years older than both of you put together, went unsaid, and her true meaning passed right over Kiba and Shino's heads. As far as they knew, she was just being modest. They couldn't possibly appreciate that, out of the 4 people to have come back in time, Hinata Uzumaki ne Hyuga was actually the least powerful. She was just skilled by the standards of ordinary humans. Compared to monsters like Naruto and Sasuke. Well, Hinata was just as good as an elite Junin, maybe on par with some of the lower tier Kage. In contrast, Sakura was pretty much second in power only to her teammates. Theoretically, the Pinkett was good enough to go toe-to-toe with Hashirama or Madara at the top of their game. Excuse me, miss, but what might your name be? Well, speak of the devil. Team 8 came into an open area, a landing between stairwells. They were not the only ones there. Sakura. Oh, a most beautiful name for a most beautiful maiden. A bowl-cut, black-haired youth in tight green spandex struck a pose that might have been cool 2 generations prior, standing before the members of Team 7. Please, Sakura-san, he exclaimed, will you not go out with me? I swear, I will protect you with my life. Naruto snorted, and Sasuke ground his teeth. Shino quirked a single eyebrow, and Kiba glowered at Hinata's other friends. Team 8 went unnoticed by the trio, who were focused understandably on the green-clad lad. Kiba skulked sulkingly up the stairs, clearly not in the mood for a meeting with Team 7 right now. Shino followed him, only mildly interested in the romantic dramedy proceeding below them. Hinata lingered behind for only a moment, before turning to follow her teammates up to the 3rd floor. She blew at Naruto, who looked over his shoulder and silently smiled at her. And so now we join Team 7 in media res. Sakura tittered and curtsied, smiling kindly at the athletic older boy. She did not give any indication of having noticed Hinata and friends passing on through, smiling politely at Rock Lee, for this was, of course, who addressed her. "Oh, my, you flatter me, Lee-kun," she said. "But I'm afraid to say that I am already spoken for. You have my apologies." A twinkle came into her eye, the glittering mischief of a precocious matchmaker as she stood back up from her curtsy. "Perhaps you should try looking a little closer to home," she suggested, thinking of a certain teammate of his. Lee edged his head to one side, staring at Sakura uncomprehendingly. "You are spoken for already," he said, sounding miserably disappointed. Sakura's smile softened, and she felt a pang of sympathy for the poor, impressionable lad. He couldn't really help being such a sucker for a pretty face. And Sakura was very pretty, in her personal opinion, so Lee could hardly help himself. "I'm sorry," she told him, smiling sincerely. "You seem like a very nice guy, and I'm sure there's a girl somewhere out there who would be glad to have you. Maybe even someone you already know," she suggested again, thinking of a certain brunette. Sasuke resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Sakura had been insisting for years that Lee and Tenten could make a perfect couple, and nothing he said could dissuade her from this notion. She was very stubborn when it came to matters of romance, and Naruto did not help things on that front, either. If anything, the blonde had taken to egging Sakura on, and encouraging her more troublesome matchmaking proclivities. Sasuke himself could not give less of a damn about other people's lives, but Naruto and Sakura were always hatching harebrained schemes to pair off their friends and acquaintances. At least 2 marriages had come about as a direct result of their machinations, Choji and Karui, and Kiba and Tamaki, plus a number of brief flings and one-night stands. He could still remember their rather disastrous go at hooking up Shino with Kiba's sister. By the time the dust had settled, nearly 30 people were in need of hospitalization, and several million ryo in property damage had been done. And that was just the first date. Sasuke fought down a shudder, and decided that it would be in everyone's best interests for him to intervene now. For every happy couple to result from Naruto and Sakura's compulsive matchmaking, there were a half-dozen explosive breakups, and more than a few strongly worded restraining orders. He was not in the mood to see what kind of drama could erupt from a self-destructed Lee-Ten relations. "Lee," the Uchiha heir growled the taijutsu specialist's name. "Weren't you going to challenge me to a spar?" Lee blinked. He frowned, and turned to stare at Sasuke. "Was I?" he said confusedly, looking a touch skeptical as he glanced down at Sasuke's missing arm. A frown tilted his eyebrows, curling his lips downward. I don't know. "Of course you were," Sasuke said flippantly. "Why else would you come seek us out?" "Maybe he wanted to challenge me," Naruto interjected, a glimmer of laughter in his eyes. "I'd like to think my reputation really precedes me these days." Sakura snorted, a most unladylike noise. "Yeah, right," she said. "The only reputation you have is as a class clown. And I am hilarious," he said with a grin. "Hilariously full of yourself, maybe," Sasuke said, rolling his eyes. Naruto scoffed. "Oh, please. Like you're one to talk." Sakura smirked, and wrapped an arm around the raven-haired Uchiha's waist. "I wouldn't mind being full of you, dear," she purred into Sasuke's ear, giving him an all-too-suggestive wink. Lee went beet red, and averted his gaze anxiously away. Sasuke, for his part, shivered and smiled weakly at his once-and-future wife. Naruto rolled his eyes. "I think that's what most girls our age would say," he quipped. "If, they had the guts." Sasuke made a face. "I don't know," he muttered. "Some of those fangirls were pretty forward, last time around, and that's before even counting the likes of Karen." Naruto looked momentarily confused at this statement. Mon, really? He said thoughtfully, too low for Lee to hear. Damn, I'd almost forgotten. By the time I got to know her, she and Suigetsu were pretty much already an item. It's surreal, isn't it? Sakura whispered in agreement, softly giggling. To think that dumpy, mothering housewife used to be one of Sasuke-kun's most aggressive fangirls. She mellowed out a lot after the first few kids, said Sasuke with a nod of agreement. Thank God. Sakura nodded, and tightened her arm around Sasuke's waist. With a playful grin, she leaned into planta on his cheek. How many was she on? She wondered meaningfully. I can't seem to recall. Last I heard, she and Suigetsu were trying for a seventh, Sasuke said, a hint of disbelief in his expression. Lord only knows how she kept all those brats fed. She always wanted a big family, though, Naruto interjected. Or so she told me, at least. Yeah, I think she said something similar to me, too, Sakura nodded. And I suppose Suigetsu could make a decent amount of money with his mercenary work. He participated in lots of medical experiments, too, I understand, Naruto added. Really? Sasuke ed an eyebrow. That's a surprise to me. The blonde shrugged. He said it was nostalgic. Sakura pulled a face. That is so weird. I know, right? Always knew that guy was messed up. Sasuke snorted back a laugh. Lee was at a loss for words as he watched Team 7 carry on talking. He stared, rooted in place by an awkward mix of indecision and politeness, as the trio turned to continue up the stairs, seemingly forgetting him completely. He blinked owlishly. I wonder what Sakura-san meant by, someone closer to home. He quietly puzzled. Perhaps I should ask Tenten. Maybe she'll know something about it. As Sasuke, Sakura, and Naruto disappeared up the stairs, Lee turned and left to look for his own teammates. They are both girls, after all. Tensions in the waiting room were dreadfully high. Genin squads crowded every inch of the room, many of the older ones surly and antsy and just itching to see some blood. Ninja from all over the continent were there, representatives from villages as far-flung as Suna and Aim, eager to bust some heads and prove their worth. Most of these genin were a fair deal older and more experienced than the rookie 9, even Team Guy had only been in active duty for a year and change, to say nothing of cells 7, 8, and 10. But most of the other competitors were hardened, battle-tested shinobi, and almost none of them had any patience for little children. Ino Yamenka did not seem aware of this, as she scanned the room for her crush. She was standing with her teammates, Shikamaru and Choji, not too far from the entrance. Pale blue eyes flicked sharply over the crowd, clear and penetrating as they searched for Sasuke Uchiha. A civilian might have been unnerved by Ino's eyes, with their unnaturally pale blue irises, flat and ghostly, devoid of pupils. If eyes were the window to the soul, then young Ino looked like a woman possessed. Shikamaru would have considered this an accurate descriptor, at least whenever she got started on Sasuke-kun. He's not here yet, the shadow user drawled, leaning boredly against a nearby wall. We would have noticed him by now if he'd gotten here before us, and we've seen everyone who has come through that door since we arrived. Ino shot Shikamaru a dark look, narrowing her eyes and curling her lip. She fidgeted anxiously, clearly overcome with nervous energy. I don't need your snark, Shikamaru. She sniped, flicking her gaze over to the door. Just keep your eyes open. I don't want to miss him. Choji shrugged, looking over his shoulder at some of the other teams in the room. Who's to say they'll be coming? Maybe their sensei doesn't think they're ready for these exams yet, he suggested. Shikamaru sighed. As much as I wish that was the case, Choji, he muttered, if only so Ino would settle down and quit looking for him, we know they'll be here. Asuma told us that Kakashi was the first one to nominate his squad, remember? Choji got a thoughtful expression on his face, and he slowly nodded his head. Oh yeah, that's right, he said. I'd nearly forgotten about that. He hid his head, looking askance at one of the other Konoha teams. Huh, I dunno, then. Maybe one of them didn't feel up to taking the exams. Asuma-sensei told us it was an all-or-nothing sort of deal, that you need to be in a team of 3 to participate. Sasuke-kun is more than ready for these exams. Ino hissed, giving Choji the evil eye. She took a deep breath, slowly shaking her head. He was never the sort to back down from a challenge, back when we were all at the academy. I don't see why he would feel the need to start now. And Naruto's too dense to even consider that the Chunin exams might be too much for him, Shikamaru drawled, eliciting a nostalgic chuckle from Choji. He's not the brightest, or the strongest, or the most skilled, but that moron's as stubborn as all get out. Ino frowned, her expression darkening. You don't think Sakura would choose to hold Sasuke-kun back, do you? She said. I know those two have been getting close, but if she thinks I'll forgive her for something like that. She clenched her fists, and her eyes flashed. Shikamaru sighed, and he rolled his eyes. Women, he thought ruefully. Whether they're young or old, they're all just as much of a pain in my ass. Ino shot him a sour look, guessing well enough what her teammate was thinking. Don't you start, Shikamaru, she said warningly. You're not any better. I have no idea what you're talking about, he replied blandly. I didn't say a word. You were thinking it, she growled. I know what you're like. Choji chuckled good-natured and reclined against the wall. The door opened. Kiba Inuzuka strutted idly into the room, followed shortly by Shino and Hinata. Then he took one look around the room, and his self-assured demeanor promptly deflated, punctured by the weight of several dozen cold, assessing glares. Hot damn, are all of these guys seriously genin? He mumbled, suddenly looking much less certain of acing the exam. Yes, probably, said Hinata calmly, sparing a reassuring smile for her teammate. Kiba reciprocated only weakly, looking now like he wanted nothing more than for everyone's scrutiny to fall on someone else. Nobody seemed to notice Shino. Kabuto Yakushi was cool and collected as he scanned over the assembled genin. Team 7 walked in through the door, and as expected their arrival caused quite a stir. The trio thumbed their noses at everyone in the room, all but outright saying that they would personally kick every single one of their asses. This, of course, did not go over well with the other assembled genin. Black glares like leaden weights fell on Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, each of whom acted perfectly unperturbed by the icy looks they were receiving. If anything, they seemed almost amused by this attempted intimidation. It was exactly the opening Kabuto had been waiting for. He walked up to the 9 rookie genin, mentally getting into character as he approached. Outwardly, he projected a harmless, friendly air which could let him get close to his targets without raising any suspicions. He radiated an aura of inoffensive normalcy that enabled him to slip under the radar with ease. Nobody paid any attention to Kabuto, because he wasn't anyone worth taking note of. That was the most important skill for a spy. Being able to blend into any crowd with minimal effort was a very rare gift. Most people had tells that gave it away when they were trying to keep a secret, got anxious or tense in high-stress situations. But Kabuto could go behind enemy lines with a disarming smile plastered on his face, make nice with people who would kill him in an instant if they knew his true motives, act perfectly ordinary and unremarkable. Some people thought of spies as people dressed all in black, fighting off hordes of enemies and running across rooftops under the cover of night. And while Kabuto had done such things once or twice, the mark of a truly good spy was the ability to have yourself seen but not scrutinized, to register in people's minds as nothing unusual or suspicious. You had to act like you belonged wherever you were. Kabuto was a master of the mundane and banal. He could smile and chat about meaningless things, lead a conversation wherever he wished, and have no one be any the wiser. That was just how good he was. Getting the trust of some rank genin would be no problem for a spy of his skill. He could give them some harmless advice, dazzle them with his knowledge, while still emphasizing his clumsiness and ineptitude. The best spy was the man nobody looked at twice, and Kabuto was a master of going overlooked. There was no reason to think his cover could be blown by these greenhorn brats. His mission in the Leaf was nearing its end, and soon enough he would be more used to Lord Orochimaru outside of the village. Once the invasion was carried out, there would be no more need for him to stay undercover in Konoha. The ninja info cards he showed those Inoshika Cho brats were nothing extraordinary by his standards. It was a mere parlor trick that could be pulled off by any sufficiently astute genin, and Kabuto did not put any of the truly valuable intel on those things. Any ninja cryptanalyst worth their salt would be able to work around his chakra encryption. Anyone who got suspicious of him and tried to search those cards for sensitive information would find only data which could have been reasonably gathered through hearsay and rumors. Kabuto was cautious. He kept most of his best cards up his sleeves, hiding a couple aces even from Orochimaru. He showed only what he wanted people to say, played the folks around him like a fiddle, and guilelessly leaked top-secret intelligence to the single most dangerous rogue nin on the planet. Akatsuki may have had more powerful shinobi, but none of them could rival Orochimaru's duplicitous cunning. He was the snake in the grass, waiting hidden in plain sight, patiently learning and plotting as he calculated the best moment to bare his fangs and strike. Orochimaru was clever and unscrupulous, willing and able to play a much longer game than anyone else. Kabuto learned espionage from the master of lies, a man who spoke with a forked silver tongue. He could deceive the most canny man alive, and walk away without an ounce of suspicion attached to himself. Even if caught all but red-handed, he could smoothly and spotlessly bullshit his way out trouble. He had been in the spy business from a young age, and had been considered so good at what he did that he was just too dangerous to be left alive. He lived his life in a web of lies and half-truths so tangled that nobody alive knew so much as even his true name. He was a weapon created by the machinations of the shinobi world, a man with no past and no name, a cursed Muramasa which had turned upon its former masters, forged in deceit and tempered in treachery, bathed in blood and shadow. He was a ninja in the most classical sense, a spy in plain sight, and a killer none would suspect. He thumbed his nose at the likes of Danzo, Shinobi no Yami, Shimura and walked a razor's edge under the scrutinizing gaze of Lord Orochimaru. To even suggest he would slip up in the presence of mere children would be laughable. The kids didn't suspect him, no. He lied to their faces, endearing himself to them with a harmless demeanor and unassuming grin. He played his role to the letter, and they danced on his strings without a hint of deviation. Word for word, his meeting with them went exactly as he had planned. He did not make any mistakes. He did everything he set out to do in approaching them, convincing the genin of Teams 7, 8, and 10 that he was their friend, and meant only to help them. Even young genius Shikamaru clearly suspected nothing. They saw only what Kabuto wanted them to. Or so he had thought. So he had planned it out in his head. But the moment he brought out his ninja info cards, Sasuke snorted and called them a cute trick, while Sakura shamelessly snatched them from his hand, asking if he had any cards about her. Kabuto could only blink owlishly at his now empty hands. He stared at his palms for a second, before whipping his head up to watch the pinkett effortlessly reveal the contents of his ninja info cards. And while this was no great feat, it still irked him a little to see someone as inexperienced as her treat his chakra encryption like it wasn't even so much as a mild inconvenience. He bit back a scowl as Sakura sorted through his cards and Sasuke gently pushed a very clingy Yamanaka heiress off of his person. Oh, Sasuke-kun heart, even with just one arm, I know you're good enough to beat everyone here heart. He watched Naruto peek over Sakura's shoulder, humming occasionally, or nodding his head, as he looked over the cards. Hey, I think I remember that guy, he said to one card, and, wow, those are some shitty stats, he commented on another. I wonder how up-to-date ours are. The way he said this last sentence set up a small, paranoid warning flag somewhere in the back of Kabuto's mind. But before he could think any more on the intonation of the blonde's words, Sasuke interjected with a scoff. If he had our real stats on those cards, he wouldn't be acting so condescending, the Uchiha said, shooting a seemingly amused look at Kabuto, with an expression like he was watching a foolish child try to climb a tree that was much too tall for them. Naruto hummed thoughtfully at this, and Kiba rankled at the implication of Sasuke's words, snapping, "Team 8 is gonna leave you losers in the dust." Young Hinata giggled at this, her eyes twinkling, and Shino's expression was unreadable. "You shouldn't underestimate them," she said to her teammate. "Naruto-kun and his friends are very strong." Kiba seemed to wince at this statement, and he shot a glare at Naruto as if the boy was somehow solely to blame for Hinata's high opinion of Team 7. Shino put a hand on the Inuzuka's shoulder, earning himself a scowl from the boy and a short growl from his dog. Choji was eyeing Akamaru with a thoughtful look, as though sizing up a Christmas goose, and Ino was alternating between glaring at Sakura and making doe eyes at Sasuke. Shikamaru looked like he wanted nothing more than to find himself a nice quiet corner and be rid of all this noise, but a look from Ino stopped him from wandering off. Sakura's face lit up as she spotted a card with her picture on it, and she held it up to the light as though checking for a watermark. Naruto took one look at the card and let out a laugh. "Oh, wow," he said, his eyes gleaming with mirth. "He's got your measurements right there for everyone to see." For a moment Kabuto was bemused by this statement, but he was distracted from his confusion by the sudden thought that Sasuke was going to snap and rip out his throat, judging by the look on the boy's face. But then Sakura lightly swatted Naruto on the back of the head and told him not to go spouting off bald-faced lies, which greatly lessened the intensity of Sasuke's death glare. Kabuto couldn't help but feel relieved at that. Sakura, turning her attention back to the card, gave the listed stats a scrutinizing glance. "Let's see," she muttered. Ninjutsu rated at 2, Taijutsu is a 1, 3.5 Genjutsu, that's almost close to accurate, strength, speed, and stamina are all listed around a 1. Wow, that is really off. Man, those are all way outdated, Naruto remarked, letting out a laugh. "Definitely," Sasuke remarked, and he shot Kabuto an almost amused look. There was a smile in his onyx eyes that both galled and relieved the spy. At least Sasuke no longer looked ready to kill him. That was definitely a plus. Ino looked torn between taking the piss out of Sakura for the girl's apparent boasting and agreeing unconditionally with whatever Sasuke was saying. The internal conflict was visible on her face, and after several seconds she finally settled for a weak, half-hearted chuckle. Shikamaru edged an eyebrow at the members of Team 7, before sighing and muttering something that sounded a lot like, troublesome. Kiba looked a mix of perplexed and disgruntled, and Shino stood quietly at the edge of the group. "I wonder what he has on Naruto-kun." Hinata posed the question with a guileless smile, opal eyes twinkling at the blonde in question. Naruto reciprocated with a small, relaxed smile that gradually widened into a toothy, blinding gallery of a grin. This seemingly harmless inquiry from Hinata caused Kabuto to feel a pang of irrational worry and tried to recall what, exactly, he had on the card. He'd made a few separate versions of Naruto's info card, with various degrees of classified information on them, and while he was pretty sure that the only one he had in this deck was the safe, innocuous one with zero classified intel, his more obsessive-compulsive tendencies raised a shadow of a doubt. He maintained his innocent smile, quelling the silent fretting with practiced ease. He knew for a fact that those cards were kept somewhere secure, but unless he had it right before his eyes, a small part of his brain would always give into the anxiety. If there was even the tiniest margin of room for doubt, Kabuto would invariably worry himself spare. He needed to be certain everything was in its proper place, had to check and reassure himself that nothing had changed while he wasn't looking. It was awful, not feeling like you could even trust your own mind, but Kabuto's line of work had taught him to second-guess everything. Kabuto quietly took a deep breath, telling himself to calm down even as he kept the smile on his face. His expression did not falter, not even once. He hid his doubts with a practiced ease. He watched Sakura shuffle through the deck for a few more seconds until she found what she was looking for. "Here it is," she said cheerfully, holding up the card. It contained a copy of Naruto's first go at an identification photo, hands and face painted white and red in flashy kabuki style. A few of the other rookies snorted or sniggered at the picture, while Naruto smiled and bowed, as if answering to the cheers of an adoring audience. Thank you, Naruto said with a chortle, gesturing theatrically. Hinata giggled, and Sakura guffawed at the picture. "Oh God, I thought you were joking about that," she said, pointing at the picture. "You seriously tried to get that registered as your ID photo?" Naruto beamed. "I did indeed," he declared proudly. "And I would have gotten away with it, too, if it weren't for that meddling old man." Sasuke choked back a swear and shot Naruto an evil look. "Oh, you complete and utter bastard," he said. "You're the one who put those kids up to it." Naruto did not deny this. He simply flashed a grin at him. Kabuto stared blankly, however, feeling a sudden rush of paranoia. He did a good job at hiding his worry, but only his foundation training and extensive medical knowledge managed to keep him from hyperventilating as he stared at the ninja info card in Sakura's hand. He had not made any cards using that image. Sakura suppressed a mischievous snicker at the flash of worry on Kabuto's face, and she shared a knowing grin with Naruto. It was at this point that Ibiki came in with the other examiners, barking orders at the genin and drawing all attention to himself before any fights could break out. Kabuto took this chance to snatch his cards back from Sakura's hands, trying to hide his sudden anxiety with a friendly smile that came out looking more like a pained grimace. "Listen up, you maggots," Ibiki barked. "These are the Chunin exams, not some namby-pamby tea party." He shot a piercing look at Team 7, in particular, who were smiling far too innocently for his liking. "You will shut up, do as I say, and pray to whatever gods you might believe in that I don't decide to come over there and shove a boot up your ass. Do you understand?" Sakura chuckled at this show of intimidation the interrogator was putting on. It was amusing to her, not least of which because she knew old Ibiki Morino to be a great big fluffy teddy bear when he wasn't on duty. She caught Naruto, Hinata, and Sasuke's eyes, and they smiled at her. Clearly, they shared her opinion. The other examiners led the crowd of anxious examinees into the testing room and instructed them on where to sit. Teams were split up, and genin were seated in a seemingly random arrangement. Hinata made a little game of trying to guess which of the test takers were Chunin plants as she waited to be seated. So far she had marked 3 likely candidates, as well as a few more maybes. She didn't recognize most of the Leaf Ninja here, outside a select memorable few. Either they had changed considerably with age, or, more likely, had died in the Sand Sound invasion, or one of the other subsequent conflicts. She frowned at this depressing thought, and glanced curiously over at Sasuke. Her husband's best friend was the sort of man who kept his thoughts close to his chest, and not many people could accurately read him. Hinata was one of them, with the insight of her Byakugan, and Naruto was another, with Ninshu and his preternatural empathy. Sakura, of course, knew Sasuke best. The man couldn't have hidden anything from his wife, not even if he wanted to. She could read him like an open book. Hinata idly watched an examiner point Sasuke to an allocated desk behind an older Konoha genin. She saw his eyes travel over the room as he walked to his seat, scanning over the Rookie 9, and Team Guy, and the Sand siblings, and the Odo Nin too. Onyx orbs fell at last on Kabuto Yakushi and his teammates. The flicker of emotion that passed across his face was so slight, and so quick, that barely anyone could have caught it. Hinata did, though, and she felt the urge to sigh. Please watch your temper, Sasuke. Naruto told you to refrain from doing anything rash. Almost as though he heard this thought, Sasuke shot a glower at Hinata as he reached his desk. She frowned at him as he sat down, silently reminding him that it would be imprudent to kill or maim someone who was ostensibly a fellow Konoha shinobi. He rolled his eyes at her, but seemed to get the message. Hinata smiled, relieved, and went to her assigned desk as well. It felt distantly familiar, and sure enough Naruto was seated beside her a minute later. This was a bit of a surprise. The odds of their seating arrangements being the same now as they were last time were phenomenally low, according to Sakura, but here they were all the same, in the very same spots they'd had last time. Naruto met her eyes, and she saw that he noticed this as well. Their elbows brushed together for a split second, and she heard her husband's voice in her head. Sakura knows a lot about math, but I guess she doesn't know everything. He felt a bit smug in this thought. Hinata resisted the urge to smile. Naruto had been the most stubborn doubter of Sakura's assertions. I think she was working under the assumption that our seating arrangements were randomly selected, she thought back. Or else that the process for determining them used variables which would be altered by our changed actions in the past. She could feel the moment of incomprehension in her husband's mind, and she could see his face screwing up in thought. Not the face he wore with this 13-year-old body, but the face of the 7th Hokage, the man who had fathered her children, and not the boy she'd long ago had a crush on. She giggled inwardly, thinking of how cute he looked when he was puzzled. A fraction of a second later, recognition zipped through Naruto's brain, and he mentally beamed at her. That makes sense, he thought. Sakura'll probably be annoyed that her theory didn't hold true, though. Hinata's mind brushed Naruto's, and warm affection seeped into his awareness like butterflies dancing across his cheeks. She felt a thrum of happiness, the emotions she had come to associate with the reflexive impulse of mate-wife-woman mind. She's a scientist, she assured her husband. One disproven theory just means a chance to explore alternate hypotheses. If you say so, Naruto thought back, feeling a tad skeptical. The link broke, and Hinata shrugged. Naruto smiled, and returned his attention to Ibiki. They were given their instructions, and told about how their tests would be graded. Once the pertinent questions had been answered, he then instructed them to turn over the exam sheets on their desks and begin. The 7th Hokage took one look at his exam sheet and felt the urge to laugh. Only half of the problems made no sense to him, this time. That was a considerable improvement. Cheerfully, Naruto began to jot down answers to the questions he knew. Elsewhere in the room, Sasuke breezed through his test with relative ease. While he hadn't known any of this stuff the last time around, by now he felt fairly confident with everything but the math problems, and what kind of ninja would waste time mentally calculating the trajectory of their shuriken, anyway? That was the kind of thing you just had to grasp intuitively. Also, he had never liked word problems. Hinata, as well, could answer most of these questions without cheating, although she did use her Byakugan to check her work against the suspected plants. She consciously left the left side of her desk unguarded, leaving her free arm below the quiz sheet. Catching Naruto's eye with a carefully measured scritch of her pencil, she saw him inconspicuously copy her answers from his peripheral vision. The exchange of data was subtle, made to look perfectly natural. If anyone looked closely enough to notice Naruto's eyes scanning a little far to the right every so often, they might have dismissed it as a trick of the light. He wrote his answers in a perfect act of diligence, giving off the impression of someone who was honestly working through the test. The key to getting away with cheating was knowing how to look like you weren't cheating. Not that the author is speaking from experience, or anything. Ahem. And of course, Sakura finished answering the first 9 questions before even 5 minutes had passed. Then she turned her paper over and began lazily doodling a very graphic love scene on the back of her test. She smiled dreamily, drawing a strikingly good representation of her husband as an adult making hard and hungry love to herself as an adult. Halfway through drawing the picture, Sakura got a wicked smirk on her face and started drawing in an unmistakable adult Ino, making out with Sakura's adult self. She had just been putting the finishing touches on adult Ino's hands when she felt the familiar sensation of her friend's mind transfer jutsu taking hold. Repressing a devilish snigger, Sakura permitted the technique to take hold. Ino in Sakura's body stared at the back of the Pinket's test sheet for 3 whole seconds before she properly registered what she was looking at. Then, naturally, she leapt out of her seat and shrieked hysterically. Sasuke rolled his eyes, knowing the examiners would probably deduct a few points for this outburst, while Naruto snickered, detecting the mortified embarrassment rushing from Ino. Sakura. Sit back down and shut your mouth, or you and your team are disqualified. Ibiki barked, shooting an intimidating glare at the possessed Pinket. Ino obediently did as asked, and was so flustered that she wound up reversing the mind transfer jutsu before ever actually managing to get a look at Sakura's answers. Tsunade's apprentice indulged in a victorious smirk when she regained control of her body. Soon enough, Ibiki ordered the test takers to put down their pencils and listen up. They did so obediently, the fear of God having by now been well instilled in them by the terrifying man. He then proceeded to give them all the same ultimatum as last time: opt out now and retake the exams next time, or accept the question and risk never being able to take the Chunin exams again if you get it wrong. Sasuke rolled his eyes at how quickly people started folding. It was pathetic, as far as he was concerned. Anyone with half a brain could see that this was just a bluff. The Chunin exams were an international affair, and Ibiki wasn't even that high-ranking. Examiner or not, he didn't actually have the authority to follow through on that threat. Not for the foreigners, at least. He pointedly ignored a dim recollection of himself falling for this act the last time around. Sasuke scanned his eyes over the room, looking curiously at Naruto. He could recall the blonde having an outburst the first time around, and wondered what his teammate would do now. As much as he respected Naruto, he couldn't help but worry that his friend would do something spectacularly idiotic. They had rather extensively debated the merits of various approaches, and how they would handle this whole time-traveling headache. After all, Sakura had explained the multiverse theory to them, which provided a hope that they could somehow find a way back to the timeline they had come from, and also convinced Naruto that they shouldn't try too hard to recreate their past actions. All of this, all these events and stuff, the blonde said, gesturing around at his old apartment, which had been destroyed in Pain's invasion, happened over 20 years ago from our point of view. I don't know about you guys, but I can barely remember the specifics of everything I did 2 years ago. It's been so damn long since we last went through all this stuff. Naruto shrugged. There's no way we can recall every little detail, right? Sasuke said shrewdly. Like what we ate on this day, or who we talked to on that day. Even a small divergence could wind up cascading into huge changes, and this world is a distant childhood memory for us. Don't you think we should at least try though? Hinata said, frowning a tad thoughtfully. Naruto chuckled, and gave his wife a teasing wink. I think it's a bit late for you to be saying that, he chirped. Hinata gave her husband a look, and gently swatted him on the shoulder. Oh, you. Sakura edged her head to one side, looking thoughtful. I hate to admit it, but Naruto does make a good point, she conceded. I don't really remember when we first got that mission to Wave, for instance. I mean, I'm pretty sure Sasuke was there, but otherwise. She paused, then, furrowing her brow. He was there, right? Naruto frowned. I think so, he said. Didn't he die for a little bit there? I do believe I would remember if I had died, Naruto, Sasuke replied dryly. No, no, I'm sure of it. Naruto replied. That was the first time I tapped into Kurama's chakra, though I don't think I actually knew it at the time. But I remember you taking an attack meant for me and falling to the ground. You had needles sticking everywhere out of your body and you weren't moving, remember? We were trapped inside those ice mirrors. Ah, that sounds familiar, Sasuke said, a hint of recognition in his eyes. We were fighting Zabuza's apprentice, Shiro, something or other. I think that was their name. Haku, actually, Naruto corrected, smiling wistfully. He was one of the most kind-hearted people I'd ever met, and that talk I had with him in the woods was a major turning point in my world philosophy. There was a gleam in his eyes as he spoke, and he looked about ready to go off on a world of cardboard speech. Hinata cut him off, placing a hand on his shoulder and distracting him with a soft peck on the cheek. Sasuke frowned. Are you sure you've got that right? He murmured. I thought you said this guy killed me. Well, it looked like you were dead, but I think he really just used acupressure or something to put you in a near-death state, Naruto said. Oh, so they only almost killed me, Sasuke muttered, rolling his eyes. That's a world of difference. Tons of people have almost killed you, Sakura pointed out, grabbing his hand and smiling. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, she told him, and there was a gleam of mischief in her eyes now. This is. And then she ed him. Sasuke hummed to himself, distracted by guiltily pleasant memories, and he almost didn't notice it when Anko busted in through the window. Unfortunately for the last Uchiha, she most certainly noticed him, as well as the expression on his face. While Sasuke still felt a little uncertain as to whether it was really okay for him to still enjoying and holding his wife now that they were both reverted to around the physical age of 13, he would be lying if he said that going back in time had made her any less amazing of her, or had made that magnificent brain of hers any less why. And lost as he was in distracted recollections of some especially sweet smooching, he happened to have somewhat of a, well, blush on his face. Sakura was a very aggressive Unfortunately for Sasuke, Anko happened to see this blush, and to notice him staring straight ahead, seemingly right at her. The impish special Junin's eyes lit up like the Christmas tree from hell even as Ibiki informed her that she was early. She grinned a toothy, devilish smile which promised mischief and mayhem for anyone foolish enough to cross her path, and it was with quite a smug look on her face that she turned to Ibiki and called him out on letting so many kids pass the first phase. Naruto and Sakura were very amused to notice this. Sasuke would be considerably less so, when he found out. Everyone who had passed stage 1 of the exams was given directions to a training ground on the far edge of the village, a training ground in the thickest and wildest part of the forest that crept up to the heel of the village walls. Those Konoha genin who had been around the block a time or two cast nervous glances at one another when they heard the designation of the area where they would be undergoing the second phase of the test. Training Ground 44 was well known among the more experienced ninja, and it did not have a nice reputation. Naruto was pouting as he watched Shino and Kiba basically drag his wife away. Hinata waved goodbye to him, and he waved back, but he still had a touch of a sour expression on his face as he and his own teammates headed to the area outside the Forest of Death. His hands were in his pockets, and he was practically sulking. Sasuke's expression was grimmer than usual, his eyes steely and his jaw squarely set as marched ahead of Naruto and Sakura. He was intermittently fingering his shuriken holster and adjusting his forehead protector, looking coolly determined. He seemed oblivious to the way Anko had been looking at him, like a rattlesnake spying an especially juicy rat, and he barely even looked at his teammates as they made their way down the village streets along with the other participants. His mind was clearly on very serious matters, or at least matters he took very seriously. Dark eyes glanced furtively around, suspiciously eyeing several of the foreign genin. Lips were pursed, drawn tight and thin, and he muttered in the back of his throat. When they were nearly at their destination, lagging a couple minutes behind most of the other genin, Sasuke quietly addressed his teammates. There are going to be some nasty snakes in that forest, you know, he said lowly. One's as venomous as any we've ever seen. Sakura and Naruto caught his meaning right away. It wasn't a terribly subtle code by the Uchiha standards, but he wanted to certain they understood what he was saying. We've been bitten before, said the latter, matching Sasuke's pace. We know the signs to look for, and we know how to draw the poison out. Even the foulest serpent fears the hawk's talons. How poetic, Sasuke drawled, arching a single eyebrow. Read that in a fortune cookie, did you? Naruto shrugged. A book of proverbs, actually, he confessed. Hinata got me one for my 30, well, for one of my birthdays. I wonder if we'll actually run afoul of any snakes, though, Sakura muttered, glancing pointedly at Sasuke's missing arm. They might not see us as, well, a threat, I suppose you could say, she tactfully remarked. Who else would they go after? Sasuke retorted, frowning. Sakura smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. Oh, I have a few ideas, she said meaningfully, trailing off after a moment. Would you look at that? Naruto interrupted. We're here. And so they were. Team 7 had arrived outside of Training Ground 44, where most of the rest of the Chunin exam participants were already waiting. Only a few stragglers remained, and even the very last was only a couple minutes behind Sasuke and friends. Naruto beamed and waved an enthusiastic hello to Team Guy. Sakura glanced shrewdly at Tenten, who noticed her attention and frowned. The Odango-haired brunette seemed reluctant to look in Lee's direction, her ears were a faint shade of pink. Neji, for his part, was acting nervous, and he seemed to be purposefully interposing his teammates between himself and Team 8. Most of the genin teams were keeping to themselves, and there was little to no mingling outside of their respective village groups. None of them seemed terribly eager to interact with foreigners, regardless of the ostensible purpose of the Chunin exams. The genin from Kusa and AIM, in particular, seemed especially tight-lipped and mistrustful. Both villages were quite small, although they had been around for decades, and while there weren't official hostilities between any of the villages represented here, everyone knew that there was no love lost, either. And the less said about Odo, the better. But one of the genin on one of the hidden grass squads was looking curiously at Team 7, frowning and staring at the Uzushio crests on Naruto's blindingly orange apparel. The bespectacled redhead eyed him and his teammates, looking alternately hopeful and afraid. A couple of times she looked close to standing upright and walking over to them, but she would then falter, and shrink away. Naruto or Sakura probably would have gone over and greeted the girl, but then Anko spoke up and addressed the assembled genin. Alright, boy and girls, listen up, and listen well. The pony-tailed Violette declared, standing with her back to the test takers. She stood facing a gate in the wire fence which demarcated the boundaries of the massive forest beyond. The door was secured with triple padlocks and a paper talisman, and a battered and weather-worn sign hung from it, declaring in a bold and ominous font. No trespassing. Anko turned to look over her shoulder at the genin, and many of the participants gulped in fear. A pall of dread hung over most of the genin, and Anko had a carefully cultivated look of sadistic amusement on her face as she peered at them with a haughty, condescending smirk. This is the arena for the second exam, she said with a flourish, gesturing to the towering, ancient trees beyond the fence, Training Ground 44. Also known as. She paused a moment for dramatic effect, and it sounded like one of the less resolute participants happened to whimper. The Forest of Death, she finished, putting a great deal of emphasis on the nickname. Some of the more timid test takers let out audible squeaks. Even the more hardened cynics in the crowd could at least appreciate Anko's theatrics. Sasuke frowned when he noticed the pointedly amused look Anko shot at him. Sakura smiled, though, and looked up appreciatively at the massive trees. Ooh, This is a pretty creepy place, she said, not entirely facetious. I bet all kinds of scary, nasty things live in those woods. Naruto nodded thoughtfully, eyeing the towering oaks and spruces. He smiled, breathing deeply of the green air. He felt at home among these trees, a leftover perhaps from spending half his life with an arm made of Hashirama putty. The blonde hummed absent-mindedly. Anko turned to face the genin full on. Some of the male participants, and a couple females, too, promptly found themselves quite hard-pressed to look their examiner in the eye. Even if you couldn't actually see anything through the fishnet, that form-fitting top combined with that trenchcoat draped strategically over her frame gave off the illusion of being practically. The second chief examination officer's eyes sparked with mischief, noticing this, and she widened her grin to show plenty of teeth. Hey, you twerps are about to learn the reason for that name firsthand, she said, casting her gaze over the captive audience. Amber orbs alighted on Sasuke, who rolled his eyes and scoffed. He looked both unamused and unimpressed. Please, he muttered under his breath, shooting a disdainful glance at his wife and his best friend. Don't make me laugh. We could run through this forest with our eyes closed. He spoke too softly for Anko to hear his words, but she could see his mouth and read his lips. She smiled. You're a pretty one, aren't you? She said, looking directly at Sasuke. Her grin didn't falter for even an instant. Faster than any genin could be expected to follow, Anko WPED out a kunai and threw it. She aimed it just past Sasuke, sending the blade on a trajectory that would graze his cheek before coming to a stop harmlessly in the dirt without actually hitting anyone. And even as she threw the kunai, she mustered a bit of chakra in her legs, preparing for a short, precise shunshin to bring herself behind the one-armed boy. It was a move intended to spook much weaker and less skillful opponents, perfect for psyching out rookies, cannon fodder, and mooks. For it to be effective, she had to be considerably faster than her target, had to have better aim and quicker reflexes. This sort of maneuver would be useless against someone as good as her, and borderline suicidal against someone better, but Sasuke was just a rookie genin. Or so she thought. Of course, you the reader are well aware that Sasuke is in fact a beyond cage level shinobi, and that he retains all the knowledge, reflexes, and chakra of his future self. Even the reduced proportions of his younger body were hardly more than a very mild inconvenience for a ninja of his skill. Anko was good. She was damn good. But she could not have anticipated Sasuke managing to snatch her kunai out of the air and point it at the spot where her face would be when she reappeared behind him. She wasn't that good. Anko blinked, staring at the pointed iron poised right between her eyes. She had been planning to lean forward and whisper some sweet, intimidating nothings into the Uchiha twerp's ear and maybe lick some blood from the scratch on his cheek just to really freak him out, but it seemed he had guessed her plan. Someone else might have been disconcerted that a one-armed rookie genin had managed to catch their kunai without getting a hair out of place and then flawlessly anticipate the end destination of their body flicker. Uchiha or not, Sharingan or not, that was a hell of a feat, and something that a more paranoid individual might call uncanny, or even suspicious. Anko simply laughed. Well, she said, cheerfully grinning. Good on you, kid. You might actually make it out of the forest alive with moves like that. And, seeming completely unperturbed by the fact that a very sharp kunai was only centimeters from her brow, Anko nonchalantly planted a teasing on the boy's cheek. Keep your guard up, handsome, she said, her tone a patronizing sing-song. It'd be a real shame for anything to happen to that pretty face of yours, heart. Sasuke blinked. For a moment, he stared into space. Then his eyes widened, his jaw went slack, and his cheeks burned bright red. He dropped the kunai and recoiled with a yelp, whipping his head around to stare at Anko. He looked stunned and scandalized by the sudden smooch. Anko grinned ferally. Sakura giggled, and Naruto snorted back a laugh. I'll keep that in mind, Sasuke squeaked. You could have fried an egg on his face at that moment, and he slumped forward awkwardly even as he inched backwards from the woman. Laughter gleamed in Anko's eyes, and she was smirking knowingly as she stepped back and turned to once more address the assembled genin. She proceeded to give a short rundown on what they would be doing for the second phase of the exam, casually psyching out the test takers with her cheerfully sadistic act and unabashedly morbid statements. Naruto elbowed Sasuke in the ribs as Anko passed out the consent forms. He gave his friend a rakish grin and waggled his eyebrows, pointing with his eyes to Anko's chest region and signing, "Squeezed melons." Sasuke gave Naruto a covert 3-inch punch to the gut and silenced him with a black look. Not another damn word, his expression seemed to say. He wrapped his arm conspicuously around Sakura's waist, earning a strangled whine and dismayed look from Ino, who happened to spy this. I'd almost forgotten how fit Anko-san used to be, Sakura whispered teasingly, reciprocating Sasuke's defensive embrace of her. She's very attractive, isn't she? Not to say that she wasn't cute the other way, of course. Sasuke choked at this, and WPED his head around to give her a look. Not helping, he hissed, slouching a little further. Sakura bit back a giggle, and absent-mindedly accepted a trio of consent forms for her and her teammates. She smiled at Anko, who chuckled, winked teasingly at Sasuke, and muttered something about randy little brats before moving on to the other participants. Once everyone had received their consent forms, Anko proceeded to explain the test. Sasuke didn't pay that much attention to what she said. He was trying very hard to look anywhere but at their examiner. His cheeks were still burning pretty hard, and while the worst bits of discomfort had receded, he could remember much too vividly how certain parts of her anatomy had squished into his back. That damn woman was far too carefree. She was infuriatingly exuberant with absolutely no sense of personal space. Like a freaky, unholy mix of Naruto and Orochimaru. Sasuke shuddered at the thought. Horrifying. When the word was given, the teams darted through the gates and into the forest of death. This was the sort of place that only an Ent or a Mokuden user could love, old and wild and preeminently treeish, a country that belonged not to fleeting man or beast, but to the ancient and gnarled titans. It was dark beneath the primeval eaves, and an earthy scent of growth and decay hung thick in the air. Genin cells raced into the forest, flitting between the massive trees like ants scurrying about an elephant's feet. Some hurried ahead, others hanging back to lay traps, while others tried their hand at actively seeking out the other teams. Hinata let Shino and Kiba lead the way to a spot she vaguely recalled from the last time around. Shino said something about giant flying leeches, and Kiba made a remark about home team advantages. The idea, it seemed, was to lie in wait for a foreign team to run afoul of the native fauna and take their scroll when the leeches attacked. My colony can produce pheromones to deter most of the indigenous predators, so we should be safe, Shino said. But most of the other teams won't have such an advantage. Right, and Akamaru can warn us about anything that wouldn't be afraid of your bugs, Kiba agreed, nodding eagerly. His eyes were bright with enthusiasm, and he was grinning toothily. Survival exercises were his bread and butter, and Shino was similarly adept. This particular test would be a piece of cake for Team 8. And sure enough, almost right away another team came stumbling into the area, and fell prey to the leeches. Horrified screams rang through the woods, and Hinata was tempted to step in, especially when she saw the leaf headbands. We should probably get those leeches off of them, she suggested to her teammates when the last of the unfortunate genin fell unconscious. It wouldn't be very patriotic of us to leave fellow Konoha ninja in such a state. Kiba gave her an odd look at this. Shino hopped down and started to rifle through the insensate genin squad's pockets. They signed the waivers, Kiba said with a shrug. Everyone in this forest is an enemy. But what kind of enemy? Hinata asked him rhetorically. Certainly there are some people in this forest I would not object to leaving like this. She thought of Kabuto and his teammates, in particular, and Orochimaru as well. He was somewhere in this forest even as they spoke, probably tracking down Team 7. Her fingers twitched. But there are also many people I would say are only technically our enemies, she continued after a moment's silence, shaking her head and clearing her thoughts. Especially the other leaf ninja. Kiba frowned, as though she had just suggested something completely preposterous. Ain't many people here I wouldn't mind throwing to the wolves, he muttered peevishly, no doubt thinking in particular of Naruto and the rest of Team 7. Hinata sighed. Kiba was very loyal to his friends, but it seemed he didn't put much store by nationalism or village chauvinism. In one way, this was a very progressive, egalitarian attitude to have. But it was also frustrating in other ways. I found their scroll, Shino said, calling up to them. It would seem we're in luck. Kiba pumped a fist in the air and crowed victoriously. All right, he cheered. Sucks to be those losers. Hinata smiled exasperatedly. Would you mind removing those leeches, Shino-kun? She politely requested. I'd rather not have the deaths of fellow Konoha shinobi on my conscience. Kiba rolled his eyes at this, but he didn't say anything to directly challenge her remark. This was not to say, mind you, that he took it with any sort of grace. Wouldn't have figured you for the sort to practice favoritism, he grumbled. Hinata smiled beatifically. I haven't the faintest idea what you mean, she said innocently. I am simply looking out for Leaf Village comrades. Kiba frowned, and looked like he was about to say something else to this. He didn't get a chance, however. A roaring of wind and thrashing of boughs reached their ears, cutting him off, and a second later they were caught in a hurricane, tumbling head over heels in a rushing vortex. They were sent flying like ragdolls, scattered as leaves before a gale, their world spinning and spiraling out of control. Hinata had just enough time to recognize this as a wind-style ninjutsu before she lost sight of her teammates. She was barely able to right herself in midair before crashing into a tangle of thorns and brambles. That was not terribly pleasant. She got scratched in places she'd almost forgotten she had, and it hurt like a sumbitch. Mentally swearing a blue streak, she sprang back to her feet and out of the underbrush. She willed her chakra up and out. Pressure built around her eyes, and she felt veins bulge. Her field of view spread out and extended dizzyingly quickly, reaching a distance of several kilometers in a fraction of a second. Oh, shit. This is not good. She saw her teammates. Kiba looked dazed, like he'd hit his head on something less than soft, and Shino's colony was buzzing about him in distress. She also saw a giant snake headed towards each of them. And that wasn't even the worst news. No, that honor belonged to the gender-ambiguous grass nin standing before her with a predatory smile and dangerously gleaming eyes. She saw this person's chakra, and knew immediately that it could only be Orochimaru. Or at least she hoped it was Orochimaru. It would not be terribly nice to find out there was more than one cage-level shinobi running around the forest of death. Hello, little girl, the alleged genin said, smiling at Hinata wickedly. It would seem you have been separated from your other teammates. Perhaps I could help you find them. Every word out of that mouth was dripping with perilously saccharine venom, and Hinata unconsciously slid into a combat stance. No thank you, she said. I can already where they've landed. The possible Orochimaru's eyes lit up at this, and it licked its lips. Marvelous, he breathed, and Hinata shuddered at how pleased this voice sounded. She'd forgotten just how indecent Orochimaru could make even the most innocuous statements sound. How wonderful for you, to have already achieved such control over your bloodline limit at such a young age. God, it sounded like he was having an orgasm with every word he spoke. And now Hinata found herself thinking of Orochimaru having. Her breakfast very nearly propelled itself back out of her mouth in response to the ensuing mental images. An acidic bile taste befouled the back of her tongue, and her stomach lurched horribly. She gagged and came uncomfortably close to emptying her guts on the forest floor. "Thanks for the compliment," she mumbled insincerely, trying hard to take her mind off of those awful, awful thoughts. She took a deep breath, carefully assessing Orochimaru, and trying to decide the best course of action. Shino and Kiba were taking care of their snakes, fortunately enough. The former had engulfed the probable summon in chakra-draining Kikaichu, while the latter had tossed his canine familiar a soldier pill and flung himself into the serpent's gaping maw, a whirling dervish tearing through the creature's unprotected esophagus. If nothing else, at least her teammates could take care of themselves. That was good. It was doubtful she would get a chance to help them if things went the way she was starting to dread. "I really hope you haven't come here for my body," Hinata said, concentrating the bulk of her attention on the possible Orochimaru before her. "Because it isn't really mine to give away, if you understand me. It hasn't been for almost 14 years, I believe." The supposed grass ninja chortled in a disturbingly sultry fashion. Hinata shuddered and forced to ignore this. "Yes, we all owe our lives to divine providence, do we not?" said the ambiguously gendered individual in a tone which suggested that they found the very notion to be laughably quaint. "But it is man's prerogative to forge his own path regardless of heaven's mandates. If we allow ourselves to be held back by childish concepts of morality, then we will never advance beyond what we have now. Your only obligation, in the end, is to yourself." Okay. Now Hinata could say almost certainly that this was Orochimaru. Probably. Not many people in their line of work cared one way or another about ethics, but the infamous snake summoner seemed to perceive codified morality as a personal insult. "That is not quite what I meant," Hinata said blithely. "You can hardly give away something that is jointly owned, after all." She noticed a glint of amusement in Orochimaru's eyes. "My, how quickly children grow these days," he purred. "But I am a rather jealous sort, I'm afraid. I have no intentions of sharing my body." He struck, as swift and sudden as a viper, lashing out with a knife-handed blow that sliced through the brush and brambles as effortlessly as a wind chakra blade through butter. Or granite. There wasn't much difference between the two, really, not to shinobi of their level. As it was, mind you, Orochimaru's attack might as well have been a soft nudge. It would not have made a difference either way. You kind of have to land your attacks in order for them to do anything, after all. Hinata was about as slippery as soap in a prison shower, and failing to pin her down tended to have similarly unpleasant repercussions. "I'd say it's no more yours to take than it is mine to give, personally," Hinata blithely quipped, a finger jabbing into her assailant's sternum. "But then maybe that's just me." She skipped backwards, fluidly sidestepping a retaliatory swipe. The heel of her palm clapped sharply down on Orochimaru's tricep, parrying his arm aside and making him hiss. He made to circle around her, a quick feint to her right before strafing to her left, quickly weaving a few hand seals. But she anticipated this, apparently, and he only just managed to spring over her sweeping low kick. Orochimaru was no slouch in any department, it should perhaps be reminded, and he was easily a cage-level shinobi. This was not the sickly armless wretch who had been killed in his bed by a presumptuous teenager, or the technically reformed scientist who had slowly faded into obscurity. This was the man who had spent over 4 decades mastering one jutsu after another in relentless pursuit of knowledge and power, a shinobi sufficiently strong and cunning to single-handedly conquer an entire nation. Hinata had some serious skills herself, and was in raw ability good enough to match the snake summoner blow for blow. Furthermore, she had a better idea of his capabilities than he did of hers. The gentle fist was a formidable style, and her Byakugan granted her an enviably complete awareness of the battlefield. She pressed her advantage and kept in close, striking swiftly and ruthlessly at every opening she could find or create. But as the exchange of blows continued, and the seconds of their fight drew on, it became apparent that Hinata was at an unfortunate disadvantage. Her body was much smaller than it used to be, and did not have the years of physical conditioning she subconsciously expected it to have. Against most enemies this would not have been an issue. Clever chakra manipulation could enhance her speed, reflexes, and striking force to the maximum of her ability, and her 20-some years combat experience would have been sufficient to give her an advantage in most cases. Orochimaru was more experienced, though. He was genuinely brilliant and perilously clever. He had been a shinobi for almost twice as long as her, and had fought through far more battles than she had ever seen. The better part of Hinata's career after the Fourth Shinobi War had been rather uneventful, with a few minor, and not so minor, exceptions. While she was not the sort to let discipline languish in motherhood, she had still not been in a serious life or death battle for several years. Orochimaru, in contrast, was at this point in time the sort to actively seek out trouble, and stir up conflict wherever he went. He was as far from being out of practice as you could conceivably get, and age had taken no significant toll on his abilities. Really, it said a lot for Hinata's skill that her weaknesses only became apparent against a foe of Orochimaru's level. Not that he could really press his advantage. She had kinda already blocked off his tenketsu by the time she realized all of this, which one could argue meant that Orochimaru didn't actually have the advantage at all, but whatever. Gentle step. Twin lion fist. Oh god, not the face. Sasuke looked up from the rain genin at his feet, a small frown on his face. Did you hear something just now? He asked his teammates, who were in the process of searching two other participants from AIM. Nope, not a thing, said Naruto, absent-mindedly stripping the unconscious teen beneath him. Why? Did you? I don't know, maybe, Sasuke replied. It was probably just the wind, Sakura said dismissively. Her face lit up as she pulled off her subject's gas mask. Ooh, this one's kinda cute. A shame he hides it behind this contraption. He's probably an 8. Meh, I'd call him a 6 at best, Naruto shrugged. Maybe a 7 if he cleaned himself up. But then, I suppose I'm not really the best judge of male attractiveness. Sakura laughed, and shot a grin in her husband's direction. Of course, Sasuke's my perfect 10, she said with a wink. And Naruto, said Sasuke, a hint of amusement in his expression. Maybe a 9, she answered cheekily. But I reckon I could be amenable to an upgrade if he ever bothered to provide a little extra service. I am not walking through this forest without a shirt on, Naruto said blithely. Those branches get everywhere when we're running. Ah, you're no fun, Sakura said, pouting theatrically. Aannnd, we have hit pay dirt, Sasuke spoke up, retrieving a scroll from his subject's pocket. All right, Sakura cheered. This'll be a record time for sure. Ah, can't we at least pay Karen Nichan a visit? Naruto said, echoing Sakura's previous whine. I wanna see how she's doing. The reunion's just 4 weeks away, Sasuke retorted. You can see her then. If she decides to attend. Yes, if she decides to attend. Naruto snorted, and shot Sasuke a dark look. If it was Itachi in this forest, you'd be chomping at the bit to go see him. Sasuke reciprocated with interest, glowering acidly at his friend and liege. My ass, he sniped. Naruto retorted with a comically imperious sniff. Sakura giggled, a mischievous gleam in her eyes as she looked from one to the other. Oh ho ho, I'd pay good money to see that heart, she interjected playfully. Both men turned boys turned red as beets. They suddenly found it very hard to look one another in the eye, and both apparently became quite interested in their feet. A moment passed in awkward silence, only to be broken by a shrill and girlish shriek. Oh sweet merciful Jeebus. Sasuke blinked. Okay. I know I heard something that time. Snakes. Kiba hoarsely muttered, wiping a bit of viscera from his brow. Why is it always snakes? He was grimacing as he staggered away from the snake's remains, and Akamaru trotted after him with a strip of serpent flesh in his mouth. The human wrinkled his nose at the smell of death that started to fill the clearing, and looked down at his blood-soaked clothes. He then looked at Akamaru, whose fur had not yet gone back to white despite the soldier pill's effects wearing off. I need a serious bath, Kiba groaned. Akamaru whined at that statement, and slinked along reluctantly beside his master. Yeah, you too, Kiba told the pup. Sorry. Akamaru visibly sulked. Oh, don't give me that look. I'm sure Hinata'll be happy to give you a wash, if that makes it any better, Kiba said, rolling his eyes. Akamaru instantly perked up. Arf! He barked, wagging his tail and spattering a bit more blood on Kiba's trouser leg. Now all we have to do is find her, Kiba muttered, more to himself than to his dog. That is not supposed to bend that way. Akamaru's ears perked up, and the young Ninkin cheerfully yipped. Huh, yeah, I heard it too. Think it has anything to do with Hinata? Akamaru wagged his tail and barked. Yeah, you're probably right. Shino might be there too. And so the pair of them set off in the direction of the screams. Karen's teammates were complete and total assholes. This was the thought going through the redhead's mind as she stomped viciously through the brush and undergrowth. A thunderous look was on her face, and she was gnashing her teeth and clenching her fists. She and her team had not been in the forest for more than a few hours, and already she was feeling tempted to throttle those insufferable prats. She could barely stand her teammates at the best of times, and just the thought of having to put up with them for practically an entire week out here in the wilderness left her feeling ready to snap at the drop of a pin. Karen fumed, thinking darkly of the exchange which had just transpired between her and her fellow Kusa genin. Echoes of their last conversation were still bouncing around in her head. Hey, Karen, would you mind sewing my pants up? I must have ripped them on a tree branch. Wah, no, I'm not your mother. Do it yourself, you lazy ass. Oi, don't back sass me, twerp. I'm your elder and superior. You oughta do as I say. He has a point, you know. We've got seniority over you, kid. So you should know how to sew your own damn pants. I'm your teammate, not some whimpering bloody maid you can just order around whenever you like. And so it had gone, quickly enough devolving into the usual argument. Karen resented her teammates for looking down on her just because she was younger, and her teammates scorned Karen's opinion and continually foisted all of the most boring and unpleasant duties onto her. She asserted that she had a right to be treated as an equal. They had been on a team together for nearly a year, after all, and she felt that she had more than proven her worth, while her teammates refused to acknowledge her accomplishments and condescendingly told her to wait on the sidelines. Sure, it was strategically sound, what with how she was both their censor and medic, and also admittedly not that great in a fight besides, but Karen still resented it, and she chafed under the yoke of Kohai to her teammates, senpai. Maybe she hadn't passed her combat exams by nearly as great a margin as would have been preferable, but she still wanted to contribute something more than just being a nurse, gopher, and human radar. It was only natural that she would resent the condescending attitudes they adopted toward her. So the fight had swiftly escalated, and Karen had ultimately stormed off in a huff, fiercely muttering numerous imprecations against those smarmy gits Jin and Taro. They thought they were so great. Bah, smarmy gits, Karen grumbled redundantly. They think they're so great, bah. She kicked an acorn, gouging the surface of the soil with the toe of her sandals. The acorn whistled a good several feet through the air and ricocheted off the gnarled bark of a nearby oak. It disappeared somewhere into the foliage, clipping and rustling some of the leaves. Watching the acorn vanish, Karen felt some of the righteous indignation slip away. She deflated a bit, listening to the whisper of the wind in the leaves around her. Already she was finding herself to be feeling sheepish about her outburst, and regretful over the argument that had only recently transpired. The sensible part of Karen knew that she shouldn't have stormed off like she did, because it was dangerous in this forest, what with all of the other teams that were doubtlessly gunning for them. She may not have liked her teammates that much, but Jin and Taro were older and more experienced. They might not have got on very well at all, but damned if they weren't a good combination. Karen was their eyes and ears, and her teammates were the arms and legs. Without her they were as good as blind, and without them she was as good as defenseless. Shinobi with her affinity for extrasensory techniques or healing were rare. Individuals with a talent for both would naturally be damn near irreplaceable, especially for a small village like the Hidden Grass. Her contributions to the team were invaluable, but there was also no dismissing what those two stubborn oafs did for her. They were excellent meat shields, if nothing else. This is stupid, Karen muttered, wearily shaking her head. I should be back with my teammates, helping to track down a weak squad for an easy scroll, not moping about in the middle of a death forest teeming with dangerous beasts and enemy combatants. She spared an uneasy glance at her surroundings, feeling very small beneath the eaves of Training Ground 44. A quiet exhalation escaped her, and she closed her eyes. Kagura Shingen, she thought. It took a noticeable effort to build her chakra, and she felt a tingling spread from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. The technique itself came to her with relative ease, but the range of her perception was somewhat inconsistent, and she still needed to consciously push and hold it. Karen focused, taking several calming breaths as she reached out with her chakra sense. She felt the flickering signatures of her teammates near the edge of her perception, that had to be almost 50 meters. Could she really have wandered that far from them in so little time? She hadn't thought she'd been moving that fast, or for that long. Her temper really did need some serious work if she could stray that far from her team in a fit of pique. That was a worrisome flaw, and could be potentially fatal in a place as unequivocally dangerous as this. Karen shook her head and let her mind's eye close once more. A bead of sweat dripped from her hairline, and she wiped it away absent-mindedly. Well, at least there don't seem to be any other teams nearby, she mused. That's good. Hopefully there won't be any nasty surprises waiting for me, either. She hadn't detected any significant chakra signatures with her jutsu, but that didn't mean as much as it might. Humans weren't the only threat in this forest, and sensing animals with techniques like her mind's eye Kagura was a notoriously tricky matter. And while chakra-based traps, such as ones built around seal tags or paper bombs, could be picked up by certain sensory ninjutsu, like her own, she had no better chances of picking out tripwires or pitfalls than the next person. Especially if they were prepared by hand, which she did not doubt most of the genin here would need to do. Pits hollowed out with jutsu would stand out to her senses for a fair while after they were made, traces of chakra clinging to them like a bad smell, but traps laid through more mundane means would be effectively invisible to her sensory jutsu right from the word go. And these were shinobi training grounds, after all. It was only to be expected that there would be traps laid all over the place. Hopefully most of them would be non-lethal, but with someone like that batty sadist sending them off, Karen felt like it would not be prudent to get her hopes up. Especially given the circumstances of this exam. Just don't die. Not exactly a reassuring bit of advice, but those were the words that Anko woman had left them with. Karen was so wrapped up in her thoughts that she didn't notice the boughs and bushes beginning to rustle before her. Survival exercise. That's what this was. And Karen knew exactly what that meant. Everyone in this forest was an enemy. Even other teams from her own village probably wouldn't hesitate to attack her or her teammates if they thought it might be an easy victory. Despite that, however, right now it seemed like the biggest threat to her well-being was Ru'er. The trees shook, and the foliage exploded as a massive, grizzled bulk shoved its way through the brush and brambles. Roaring furiously, with patches of darkly red matted fur on its haunches and a foaming slaver dripping from enormous yellowing teeth, a living hill of muscle and sinew stormed into the clearing. It wheeled around, dark and beady eyes falling on Karen's petite form. There was a sense of madness in the way it flattened its ears and bared its fangs, a blind fury incurred by agonizing pain. Hot, reeking breath struck Karen straight in the face, smelling strongly of overripe berries and rotting flesh. Her ears popped. A deafening, bellowing roar rang in her through the forest, shivering her bones and resonating in her chest. It shook her from head to toe, and she kept on shaking even when the roaring stopped, and the beast snapped its jaws shut with a vicious snarl. It was fortunate that Karen hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast, or else she might have soiled herself. Meep. Exit Karen, pursued by Bear. Neji Hyuga was pensive as he led his teammates to the bank of a narrow, black creek he'd spotted winding past the toes of several ancient, hoary elms and oaks. The water was dark in the gloom of the forest's perpetual twilight, but cool to the touch, and clear when cupped in their hands. It was bitter tasting, though not foul or stagnant, and Neji downed his draught with a slight grimace. Lee and Tenten fared a little better against the acerbic taste, and they filled their canteens in anticipation of future need. The latter had a few gallon jugs in one of her storage scrolls. Might Guy may have been an eccentric teacher at the best of times, but he'd taught his pupils to always be prepared, as well as over a dozen spare flasks, and Neji himself had at least 3 redundant canteens on his own person, just in case. A squirrel darted up a tree over on the opposite bank, freezing in place for a moment as though it sensed Team Guy's scrutiny, before skittering frantically over a nearby branch and springing across to another tree. It scurried off into the dark eaves, vanishing from Lee and then Tenten's sight within seconds. Neji watched it go with a thoughtful frown, before daring another short quaff of the creek's water. It was just as bitter as the first draught, but also cool and wet, and it slaked his thirst well enough. He could probably endure the taste at need, but he would certainly never sip it in leisure. This would have to suffice for their purposes. How long do you suppose it'll be before we run into a team with the scroll we need? Tenten wondered aloud, glancing sidelong at Neji. She screwed on the cap of her last canteen, squatting quietly on the bank and pointedly trying to avoid Lee's gaze. Maybe half a day, if we're lucky, said Neji noncommittally. Tenten arched an eyebrow at this remark. Really, I wouldn't have marked you the sort to rely on luck. It's not reliance. I'm simply aware of it as a factor. I see. Well, whatever you say, Tenten drawled, giving him an wry look. Neji brushed this off and glanced towards Lee, who was filling his own pair of canteens. The green-clad Gukan apprentice seemed entirely oblivious to his and Tenten's exchange and was humming tunelessly to himself as he screwed the cap back onto his waterskin. Neji felt his lips curl into a seemingly disapproving scowl as he thought about the exam. Did either of you get a good read on any of the other participating teams? He inquired brusquely. I'm sure we can handle most of them, if it comes to that, and by we, he of course mean mostly himself, but I would prefer to avoid taking any unnecessary risks. We should approach every step of these exams with the utmost prudence. Lee and Tenten both looked at Neji, and the Hyuga prodigy crossed his arms over his chest. They didn't say anything at first, and he narrowed his eyes. Well, he impatiently prompted. Tenten gave a shrug. There were a couple squads I thought seemed poorly balanced, but most of them were eliminated in the first stage, she said. But then she paused, and thoughtfully pursed her lips. I suppose those rookies might be easy pickings, of course, but no doubt half the teams in this forest will be thinking along the same lines. Neji blanched, thinking immediately of the squad his cousin was on. Not all of them, he said, trying to hide the slight tremor in his voice. I think it would be a good idea to avoid Team 8. Tenten frowned at this, and she gave Neji another odd, penetrating look. That's the team with the other Hyuga, isn't it? She said, squinting curiously at her long-haired teammate. What? Are you sweet on her or something? In spite of himself, Neji couldn't help making a face at this comment. He felt his cheeks burn, and his gut roiled nauseatingly. Hinata, Lee spoke up, surprising the other two. That's her name, isn't it? I think she's Neji's cousin. Tenten looked away from Neji, and her curiosity apparently overcame whatever awkwardness had recently emerged between her and Lee, because she gave him the same piercingly quizzical look she'd just been giving Neji. How would you know that? She asked him. Lee shrugged. He talks about her, sometimes, he said a touch airily. Or he used to, at least. I do not think he has mentioned her in a while, though. Neji coughed anxiously, aware that he'd been avoiding the subject of his family in general, and Hinata in particular, ever since that little incident after her academy graduation. Tenten blushed, though, and stared down at the creek with a carefully neutral expression. Oh, I guess I must not have been paying attention, she said a touch lamely. Lee eyed her curiously at this admission, but he apparently didn't read anything much into it, as he only stared for a couple of seconds before shrugging and turning his attention back to Neji. Well, I am not certain about Team 8 or 10, but I imagine Team 7 would provide us a challenging fight. Their teacher is Guy-sensei's eternal rival, after all. Oh, so the copy ninja's taken on a genin team, has he? Tenten remarked, perking up. That does sound interesting. And, Team 7, that's the one with the last Uchiha on it, isn't it? I hear he was ranked top of his year. That's hardly a surprise, said Neji imperiously. The Uchiha were a clan of the highest elite, nearly on par with even the Hyuga. It is only natural that their last loyal scion should prove a shinobi of exceptional skill. Yes, Sasuke Uchiha's reputation certainly precedes him, Lee commented. But I have heard that his teammates are also proving to be extraordinarily skilled. Who are they, again? Tenten wondered, frowning thoughtfully. Anyone we know. Naruto Uzumaki is one of them, Neji lowly muttered. I remember that name, at least. He has been spending a lot of time with Hinata, lately. He frowned, then, absent-mindedly wondering why he had the feeling that the name Uzumaki should have been known to him for another reason. Naruto, seriously, Tenten murmured, eyes widening a hint comically. I'd have marked that twerp for a dropout. He's the one who tried to take an early graduation exam when he couldn't even muster a decent clone jutsu, right? The same brat the adults were all in an uproar over a couple months back. Do you mean when the Hokage faces were graffitied? Lee said, looking at Tenten. Was that him? It must have been, Neji said. I can't think of anyone else in the village with a name as ridiculous as Naruto. Man, to think they'd stick a troublemaker like that on a team with the last Uchiha, Tenten mused wryly. Sounds like a real volatile combination, don't you think? I am not sure of that. They actually seem to get along famously, was Lee's reply. He, Sasuke, and Sakura-san are all very close, from what I have seen. He edged his head to one side. I should have thought they had been friends from the womb, for how companionably they talked to each other. It was like every other sentence out of their mouths was an inside joke between the three of them. Kakashi must be an exceptional teacher to have impressed the importance of team cohesion on them so quickly, Neji mused. Yeah, Tenten agreed. I know some older teams that could use some refreshers on that topic. Neji frowned, noticing the look she gave him at this remark. It was not accusing or reproving, but he certainly got the impression that she felt he could afford to try more actively to get along with Lee. I'm sure I haven't the slightest idea what you mean, he said loftily. Tenten rolled her eyes, but she didn't say anything else. For a moment, Team Guy was silent as they finished packing up their gathered supplies. Tenten sealed her jugs and flasks into a couple of general-purpose scrolls, and Neji adjusted the canteens on his person so they wouldn't jostle or bump noisily. Lee perked up, suddenly, just as they were prepared to depart. We shouldn't stay in one place for too long, Neji had said, and Tenten had silently agreed, and he glanced curiously up and down the tiny creek which trickled and burbled through the massive, primeval forest. Did you hear that? He asked them, looking suddenly anxious. Hear what? Tenten said, frowning at him. All I hear are the creak, and the leaves rustling. Ruer. A bellowing roar echoed through the woods, distant and faint but still undeniably audible. Shortly after that could be heard a shrill, girlish voice screaming a number of colorful invectives. Neji blinked. Tenten blushed. Oh, she said sheepishly. That. Lee frowned, and stared in the direction of the sounds. His brow knitted so tightly that his eyebrows were nearly a single continuous V of glossy black hair. It sounds like someone's in trouble, he commented. Neji sighed and resisted the urge, rolled his eyes. Of course it does, he muttered. Sasuke. Sasuke looked up from what he had been doing and glanced curiously at his teammate. Naruto looked strangely tense. Yeah, Naruto? He asked, subtly cautious. They were nearly at the tower in the center of the forest, now, and it would not do at all for them to get sidetracked by his friend's occasionally mercurial temperament. Naruto twitched. His fingers flexed, curling halfway into a fist before hesitantly pulling back and relaxing. His expression appeared strained, a conflicted twisting and contorting of the blonde's features that would have been rather comical under other circumstances. Hinata trusts me, right? Sasuke frowned. Yes, she does, he said slowly, unsure what this was about. She respects my opinion, and accepts that I only want what's best for her. Sasuke nodded carefully. She does, yeah, he said. To hear her talk, you'd almost think she believed you had the sun shining out of your every orifice. Hinata had a very high opinion of her husband. And she expects me to respect her in return, right? Naruto said. To not throw a fuss and come storming in every time she stubs her toe. To trust her to be able to take care of herself when she has to. Sasuke rolled his eyes. You've been married how long? He said rhetorically. I think you know what she can and can't handle, Naruto. The blonde smiled weakly, the expression obviously forced, and he nodded. Yeah, that's right, she can take care of herself, he said. Naruto twitched again, and his fingers curled once more into fists. They did not relax this time. Sasuke shot Naruto a concerned look. Are you okay? He asked. If something's happened. Naruto laughed shrilly. Oh, it's nothing. I'm fine, he declared. It's not like my wife is fighting Orochimaru on her own, or anything. His voice cracked as he said this last bit, his pitch rising by nearly a full octave. Sasuke blinked at the killing intent rolling off of his friend. It was erratic, like he was fighting the urge to run right over and crush Orochimaru like an insect. Naruto was obviously trying very hard to suppress it. Sasuke couldn't help but notice, however, and even Sakura looked up from the scroll she'd been lazily toying with to glance curiously at the two boys. Neither of them seemed terribly concerned, though. If she was in any serious danger, you wouldn't be standing here talking to me, Sasuke coolly reasoned, giving Naruto a shrewd look. There'd be a cloud of dust next to me, and a straight line of leveled forest leading from here to wherever Hinata is. Since you haven't run off to her rescue, I dare say she's handling herself just fine. Naruto glowered. I still can't help worrying, you know, he grumbled. We hadn't been expecting that old snake in the grass to go after her. If I'd known this might happen, I would have put him on ice the second I first felt his chakra. Sakura laughed, and patted him reassuringly on the arm. You wouldn't have, she said confidently. We both know you're not a killer, Naruto. At most, you would have beaten him within an inch of his life before turning him over to the Anbu, like what you did the last 3 times someone was stupid enough to target your wife. Naruto twitched. Those were just the people who tried to kidnap her, he replied. He turned and gave Sasuke and Sakura an almost frightening look. The assassins never had enough of a body left behind to warrant formal investigation, once I got through with them. Naruto's sake flared so intensely as he said this that a small family of birds, several squirrels, and one nearby, lounging tiger fell to the ground all at once, twitching and frothing at the mouth's simultaneous heart attacks. Sakura merely raised a single eyebrow, and Sasuke waved his hand dismissively. Neither of them so much as flinched. Is that how it works? Said the Pinkett, eyeing Naruto skeptically. Are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure that's not how it's supposed to work. He's Hokage, Sasuke said, as though this explained everything. I'd be more surprised if he hadn't been covering up any deaths. I'd probably have done the same thing in his place. Naruto nodded emphatically. And I know for a fact what you did to that one guy who tried to poison Sasuke in his sleep, he added, piercing Sakura with a gimlet eye. I'm sure your students learned all kind of things about high-velocity impacts from studying his remains, but that really is the sort of thing you should clear with me or Shikamaru, first. Sakura at least had the decency to blush. Sasuke just looked relieved that Naruto had moved on from fretting over Hinata. As if she couldn't take care of herself just fine. Briefly, Orochimaru wondered where it was, exactly, that he had gone so wrong. So horribly, agonizingly wrong. Maybe it was the human experimentation. That had been kind of extreme, in hindsight. He'd felt justified at the time, of course, and it had certainly helped that some of his earliest and tamest studies had been performed, with the Council's approval, on captured enemy combatants, and he had definitely advanced his knowledge by leaps and bounds with those experiments. But it had been so great an advancement that when he inevitably ran out of approved test subjects, he had not felt like stopping his experimentation. Resenting the legal limitations being placed on his research, he had started to look elsewhere for viable guinea pigs, quite unbeknownst to any village authorities. Of course, even when his experimentation had been entirely within the bounds of shinobi law, which was notoriously muddled and nebulous when it came to general ethics and human rights, his teacher and teammates had never really approved of it. Sarutobi-sensei had accepted, however reluctantly, that it had been a grim necessity of war, and trusted that Orochimaru would ultimately use what he learned from his testing for the betterment of Konoha's shinobi, but he'd not been happy about it. And, to be fair, this had honestly been Orochimaru's intention, at least at first. Even if he had focused most heavily, even then, on the enrichment and augmentation of one shinobi himself, in particular, it still had entirely been done for the sake of adding to the Leaf's knowledge and military strength. But somewhere along the line it seemed he'd gotten a bit full of himself and decided that he, Orochimaru, was the person singularly most deserving to make use of what he had learned from his experiments. It probably didn't help that he'd been working so closely with Danzo Shimura and the Foundation at the time. Certainly Danzo was a brilliant, effective military leader and tactician, but even at his best he tended to be a bit short-sighted, as well as far too chauvinistic to ever accept anything less than total submission to the Hidden Leaf's sovereignty from the other nations and hidden villages. That probably should have been a warning sign, really. Not to say that Danzo was a raving megalomaniac, or anything of the sort. The man was fervently dedicated to Konoha's safety and prosperity, even if at times he seemed to border on insubordination towards his old friend, Hiruzen. Danzo was a die-hard patriot, willing to do absolutely anything to ensure Konoha stayed at the top of the heap. But this was kind of the problem. Just serving a few years in Anbu could throw an otherwise decent man's moral compass off kilter, and Danzo had been working in the deepest, darkest heart of Konoha's military since long before most of village's active shinobi had even been born. Danzo had no compunctions about conscripting orphans, giving them training so extreme it'd make even Might Guy go, dude, what the hell? And forcing them to fight and kill their closest friend to mentally break them and rob them of all emotional grounding, before continuously sending them off on horrifically suicidal and morally reprehensible missions until finally they either died in action or snapped under the pressure. Root's only retirement package was an unmarked grave in the middle of nowhere. There were no pensions, health benefits, or stock options. Foundation agents were lucky if they got so much as a single sick day in their entire career, and they usually had to be all but dying in their cot to warrant even that much. If Anbu was hell, then Root was the frozen lake at its heart where Satan gnawed on Judas. So it was only natural that Orochimaru, having spent so much time in his youth studying under Danzo, nearly as much as he'd studied under Sarutobi-sensei, in fact would ultimately crawl back out from under that particular rock with a frost-bitten tongue and breath that reeked of treachery. The company one kept said a lot about their character, and when even Danzo Shimura would be considered perfectly in the right to have someone secretly assassinated, you would know that they had well and truly ed up. Maybe Orochimaru should have thought twice about turning his back on the village. It wasn't like he really wanted to destroy Konoha. After all, whatever else he might say, it had truly been his home, once. But he'd been chased out, exiled once the full extent of his experimentations had been uncovered, if only because they'd not been able to hold him down long enough for an execution. And of course there were the plots, the conspiracies,